Hi everyone, I'm Debbie Atuk. I'm a Bering Straits shareholder and a portfolio specialist for Skyview Investment Advisors. As you may know, if you've been watching this series, I've been interviewing people who have experience in investing with or for Alaska Native corporations, and we've been talking about the opportunities for economic development in Alaska, particularly for Alaska Native corporations. One of the people that I have been most excited to interview for this series is my dad, Richard Atuk, who was the very first vice president of land for Bering Straits Native Corporation. So this week I'm in Alaska, I'm in quarantine, and as a precaution of making sure that I didn't bring New York City COVID virus with me, I set up Zoom in a separate area to speak with my dad and tried to follow the regular format, but he just has so much information that I just hit record. So this week's format is a little bit different, but I think you'll really like it, particularly if you're interested in the early days of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and then the challenges of implementing the act and all of the corresponding regulations that went into forming what later became ANILCA. So I hope you enjoy. Thanks.
I was applying in different places, but at that time the act had passed, remember, and a fellow named Roy Hundorf was working for a kind of a related Native organization that had some money from whatever their sources were to help people in different ways. And somehow or another, I worked with him to get a what do you call these, description of our job, the resume. He helped me with a resume, and I think he put me in contact with BP Alaska.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, this is how things work sometimes. And the longer story short, I totally enjoyed that. So I worked there, I think a couple of years. And then they were talking about sending me to, well, actually, it didn't work that way. They didn't talk about sending me, but I knew that I had been on the job long enough. My next step was going to be to go to some other posting somewhere in the world.
Right, that's how they typically...
That's exactly what they do. By that time I had learned that, and an opportunity came up in Nome working for the Native Corporation. I took it because I knew I would say no to a posting outside of Alaska.
Okay. And that was at Bering Straits? That's the land job?
Correct. The job was at Bering Straits.
And what was the earliest work then that was on your plate as a new person there at this newly formed corporation in this new area called land?
Well, the Claims Act had passed the year before, I think, and that one of the jobs, the first job to do for a land type person was to make land selections, and for village corporations to make land selections within a 2-year time frame.
Okay, so that was why you were going out to the airport all the time, because I remember we took you back and forth to the airport all the time. So you were traveling to the villages to help them with their land selections. Is that right?
Exactly. There were a number of people traveling to the villages because the villages need to incorporate and have an entity that could sign the different things for the corporation, the business requirements. So they needed to incorporate it first. Secondly, they needed to make the land selections, file them with their signature, with their incorporation papers, and so on. So I think we did both. We talked to the villages about the Claims Act, explained the land selection part. Other people in the office also did the same thing, focusing more on the village business other than land. So you can see the overlap of those kind of things. There were 17 villages, if I remember, and so that's why there were so many trips. And it took multiple trips to get all this in place. Later on, we needed to explain land selections, what land they wanted, put it on maps, and help them with their presentation and approvals to their members, and so on.
So there is a model there for when the regional corporations worked in partnership with the village corporations to assist them. And, you know, for better or for worse, the participation in federal contracting now has created a point of potential competitiveness to prevent the regional corporations from wanting to help village corporations because they might be seen as competitors.
Well, I think that's probably something else we can get into a little later into this process we're in right now, and you'll understand the reasons when I get to them.
I had wanted you to talk a little bit about the travel that you did to Washington, D.C. back in the 70s. Did you want to talk about that?
Sure.
Okay, so my understanding is that the law was passed, as you explained to me. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was passed. But then there's the reality of the implementation. And you traveled to D.C. twice, and one of those times was to talk to the Department of Interior, and that was to work with them on drafting the implementation of the regulations of the new law.
Exactly. So what happened was there was an act that laid out what was to be done by law. But in order to do that, then the different agencies need to have regulations to define how they make the law work. And we call those regulations, and they're often quite specific as to it allows that department to transfer the land, for instance, and how that's done. And there were specific parts that were problematic because the act called for selections to be made in a certain way in the villages with language like contiguous and compact.
Okay.
So, but they didn't define what those words meant. And so in the regulation, and there was a way to limit the length versus the width. In other words, if you had one really long, skinny selection, that's what they wanted to avoid. But at the same time, it needed to be brought to earth as to what qualifies as compact, what qualifies as contiguous, which means touching all the time.
Uh-huh.
So those are the types of issues that were worked out in some of these trips and negotiations. Also with negotiating with other regions on that language.
Okay. So that means that you were working with various agencies like Department of Agriculture, Fish and Wildlife, and Forestry, as well as other regional corporations.
Yes, because each of those agencies and other regional corporations and their villages have an interest in how this language comes out and what the language actually does and means for us workers.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
I think in the past, in my whole life, these things have been very difficult to explain because people don't want to take the time to talk about regulations, compact and contiguous, and the details of how things get done in land work.
It's really it's very tricky. And also in the case, and I don't know if we want to talk about this or not, but in the case of revenue sharing that the regional corporations are required to do with their mineral wealth or their extractions, there was some complicated exchange between corporations that led to somehow an agreement where if Anwar is open, then Arctic Slope is not required to do revenue sharing. Were you a party to any of that or aware of what ultimately led to that?
Well, yes, we had to be because, again, the same act talks about 70% of the revenue of different types, including subsurface and timber owned by regional corporations, needed to be shared and left it at that. And there again, there needed to be clarification of what that means, how it is done. And because the interest is of how that's done is solely up to the regions and their villages, that was kind of kept in-house and done by the regions with each other. Presumably, if following the law that nobody else outside of the regions and the villages would really have an interest in how that works. So that was an internal negotiation first, and any implementing laws and regulations were done after that, after the regions, because now there's 12 different interests with each region owning different quantities of timber or subsurface oil or minerals, with some having a lot, others having, and so then another part of that is to define what was to be shared, because as business people know that when you develop something, you should also recoup whatever you spent on it. So defining revenues and deductions was and still is, I believe, a big part of how those formulas are made. And I want to tell you a little story here that'll help in the process. If you may have heard of a person named Roger Lang. And when maybe not, but you will later, when we started working on these things among 12 regions, then there was a discussion even at the beginning stages of how to do this. And some of the regional people got into talking about how even to process who says what when, and so long story short, we got into Robert's Rules of Orders, so we could have some kind of process here, keep order and such like. And so the group of some representatives from 12 different places, each one sending 2 or 3 people, were talking about all of a sudden Robert's rules. And Roger Lang said, no, this is our land, this is our resources, let's not use Robert's rules, let's use our own rules. And that famous time, I don't know if other people look at it as famous, but I do, is by and large our people can use our rules first and then deliver what we want and need. So this has been the cooperation among the region that what was needed to make this work. Otherwise, people might still be squabbling about the remainders of some income or deduction.
So you're saying that by putting that aside, you took out parliamentary procedures so that you guys could just talk to each other. Okay. That's really interesting. Where did that guy come from?
Southeastern Alaska.
Oh, okay.
He was a strong supporter of the original of the Claims Act.
Oh, okay.
So he was very instrumental in keeping us on our track, along with our previous governor, lieutenant governor, Malott.
When was the first time you became aware of this settlement act in your life? like, were you in college or did you know about it beforehand? Because people in the Southeast had been agitating for something like this settlement for a long time, right?
Yeah, I was younger than some of the people that were involved in it, the Noddies and the Henleys and the Malots. So I was in, I think, the early stages of getting an education in Fairbanks when this was going on.
But it really even predates their generation, I think, right? I mean, there's the very famous woman, Elizabeth Peratrovich, right? We have celebrate a day in Alaska for her work because the early Arctic Native Brotherhood, that comes from the Southeast, right? And that's all about trying to establish indigenous claims and indigenous rights. Or am I oversimplifying?
I think so, and I was not a big part of that because of my age, and so I came in just shortly after the Claims Act had been passed, or enacted is probably the better word, into law.
Okay. So, did we cover everything that you wanted to talk about with regards to Anilka, or did you want to say more about that?
I think there could be more said about the selection process, first of all,
Okay.
is that there were villages selected a certain amount of land depending on the population. So even that in and of itself, people had differences within the villages. And so our job was to help them understand this, to help them implement what they needed to, and actually give them information and our recommendations at times to what lands are the best for different uses, primarily of regional interest. But let me say this, that we left the decision, the final decisions, and it was theirs anyway, to file what land they wanted by that deadline. Remember, that was 2 years from the passing of the act to the time they had to file which lands that they wanted. And
Okay.
part of that reality is by the time we started, a half a year of that deadline had passed by already. So we were working really hard within a year and a half. And the regional selections, that the regions had special provisions in the Claims Act and also needed clarification in the enacting regulations, so we worked on that. So we saw, I think, overall that the villages and the region were in concert with regard to the importance and value of the land to their future. And I think one of the questions that comes up in the past is, they could have made a money distribution. And I know that as it is today, people are in need of income, and a distribution of equal amounts to everybody that signed up could have been done. And my evaluation of that at that time and now, that would have been long gone and not there long ago by everybody, and everybody would just sitting in their village with the village owning the land and the federal government owning the rest of where they live. And so that's a tough call to make, but I think reality shows in other places, wherever distributions are made, it comes and goes, and we would, I believe, have been left today with villages sitting on a municipal land surrounded by federal land. As it is now, they have some say on what happens to that land. It's particularly important right now with hunting season. They own that land. They can post no trespassing if they want to as a private landowner. That's one of the big places it made sense.
Well, one of the areas that I was hoping we would get to is there's going to be some opportunities, I think, for some of the corporations, the villages around that graphite that's up there, where Graphite One has, I think it's state leases, but I think that the neighboring village corporations that have land are Mary's Igloo Native Corporation and Teller Native Corporation. And I think that they have some opportunities in the way of maybe doing something with roads, having some private use, being able to charge a fee for private use.
Exactly, and as private landowners, having a development occur on or near their lands, they would have a say-so specifically with regard to access and passage through their lands if that's what the business needs to do. So that's a good example of where it makes sense. The other thing is that at the time we made land selections, we could not foretell and foresee where some of the developments would be. We did the best we could with what we had, information we had, to select lands of mineral subsurface value. But it takes a long, extended program to find those resources, and the regions and the villages didn't have enough time and money to be the ones in the business to look for them. Although that was possible, that's not the best use of resources. It's better to contract it out or be in control of whether or not it's contracted out. But when somebody finds something adjacent to you, they will want to talk to you anyway in terms of access, as that example you mentioned.